The world's greatest heroes, a sleep journey through courage and time. Introduction. The nature of hero. Close your eyes for a moment and think of a hero. Not the figures from comic books or fantasy worlds, but the real people who walked this earth, who breathed the same air, who felt fear and doubt just as we do. What makes a hero? Is it strength alone? Courage in the face of danger? Or is it something deeper? Something that transcends the boundaries of time and culture? Throughout history, certain individuals have emerged whose actions rippled across generations, whose decisions shaped the course of nations, whose courage inspired millions to believe in something greater than themselves. These are not perfect people. They were flawed, complex, sometimes contradictory. They made mistakes, harbored doubts, and faced moments where they questioned whether they could continue. Yet they persisted. They found within themselves a quality that transformed them from ordinary individuals into legends. Tonight, we journey through the lives of 5 such individuals. From the ancient shores of Troy to the modern struggles for freedom and equality, we will walk alongside warriors and peacemakers, conquerors and liberators. Their stories span 3,000 years of human history, yet they share common threads: the willingness to sacrifice, the strength to endure, the vision to imagine a better world, and the courage to fight for it. We begin in the mists of legend, where history and mythology intertwine, with a warrior whose very name became synonymous with heroic prowess. We will travel to the courts of kings and the battlefields of empires. We will witness a young woman who heard divine voices and changed the fate of nations. We will follow a teacher who showed the world that the greatest strength lies not in violence, but in restraint. And we will see a man who emerged from decades of imprisonment, not with bitterness, but with forgiveness. As you settle in for this journey, let the weight of the day fall away. These stories of courage are also stories of calm, moments of quiet determination before the storm, the stillness at the heart of action. They remind us that heroism is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to stand firm, the gentle insistence on justice, the patient endurance through years of suffering. So breathe deeply. Let these tales wash over you like waves on an ancient shore. Whether you seek inspiration, understanding, or simply the comfort of stories well told, you have found a place to rest. The heroes we will meet tonight face their challenges with both fire and serenity. They teach us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of something greater. Purpose, conviction, love for something beyond oneself. Let us begin where so many stories of Western heroism begin, in the legendary world of ancient Greece, with a warrior whose choice between a long, quiet life and brief, immortal glory continues to resonate 3 millennia later. Achilles, the warrior's paradox. The waves crash against the shores of Troy, and on the beach stands a man who knows he will not return home. His name is Achilles, and even now, separated from us by thousands of years, his story pulses with life. He is the greatest warrior in the Greek army, the son of a mortal king and a sea goddess. Blessed with supernatural skill and cursed with foreknowledge of his own death. But let us go back to the beginning, to a prophecy and a mother's love. Thetis, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, had caught the attention of both Zeus, king of the gods, and Poseidon, lord of the seas. These powerful deities competed for her affection until a prophecy changed everything. It was foretold that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father. Suddenly, having a child with Thetis became unthinkable for Zeus. A son greater than the king of gods could overthrow the entire divine order. So the gods arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal man, Peleus, king of the Myrmidons in Thessaly. From this union came Achilles. His mother, knowing the fragility of mortal life and desperate to protect her son, sought to make him invulnerable. In the most famous version of the tale, she dipped the infant Achilles into the river Styx, whose waters granted invulnerability to the gods themselves. But she held him by his heel, and that one spot, untouched by the magical waters, remained vulnerable. This detail, this single point of weakness in an otherwise perfect warrior, has given us the enduring phrase, Achilles' heel. Young Achilles was sent to be educated by Chiron, the wise centaur who had tutored many Greek heroes. On Mount Pelion, far from the courts of men, Achilles learned the arts of war, medicine, and music. He became skilled with sword and spear, learned to tend wounds and understand the healing properties of plants, and developed an appreciation for poetry and song. This education shaped him into more than just a warrior. It made him a complete hero in the Greek tradition, deadly in battle, but also cultured, thoughtful, capable of beauty. But even in these early years, prophecy shadowed his steps. Thetis learned that her son faced a choice between two destinies. He could live a long, peaceful life, marry, have children, and die old and forgotten in his bed. Or he could go to Troy, win imperishable glory, and die young. These were not hypothetical possibilities, but actual paths his life could take. The choice was his. When the Greek heroes gathered to sail for Troy, to wage war against the city that had taken Helen from her husband Menelaus, Thetis knew what Achilles' participation would mean. The prophecy was clear. If Achilles went to Troy, he would never return. Driven by a mother's desperate love, she disguised her teenage son as a girl and hid him at the court of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. For a time, it worked. Achilles lived among the king's daughters, his identity concealed. But the Greeks had their own prophecy. Troy could not be taken without Achilles. The cunning Odysseus, tasked with finding the hidden warrior, devised a plan. Disguised as a merchant, he visited Lycomedes' palace with gifts, jewelry, and fine fabrics for the women, but hidden among them, weapons. When a false alarm of attack was sounded while the women fled, Achilles instinctively grabbed a spear and shield. His warrior nature betrayed him. Faced with discovery, Achilles made his choice. He chose glory over safety, immortal fame over long life. He chose, in essence, to be Achilles. This decision reveals something profound about the nature of heroism in the ancient world. For the Greeks, Kleos, the glory that lives on after death, was worth more than life itself. to be remembered, to have one's name spoken by future generations, to achieve something that transcended the brief span of mortal existence. This was the highest aspiration. Achilles came to Troy with 50 ships of myrmidons, warriors who would follow him without question. For 9 years, he proved himself the greatest fighter in the Greek army. He captured 12 cities along the coast, his prowess in battle becoming legendary. Enemy warriors trembled at his approach. When Achilles entered the fray, the tide of battle turned. His speed earned him the epithet, swift-footed Achilles. His skill with the spear was unmatched. His rage in combat was fearsome to behold. But it was in the 10th year of the war that Achilles' story truly unfolds in all its complexity, immortalized by Homer in the Iliad. The epic begins not with glory, but with anger, not with triumph, but with wounded pride. The Greek army had captured 2 women as prizes: Chryseis, awarded to Agamemnon, the commander of all Greek forces, and Briseis, given to Achilles. When a plague struck the Greek camp, sent by Apollo in anger over Chryseis, the prophet Calchas revealed that Agamemnon must return her to her father, a priest of Apollo. Agamemnon agreed, but insisted on compensation. He demanded Briseis from Achilles. This was not merely about a woman. In the warrior culture of the ancient world, prizes taken in battle represented honor, proof of valor. They were symbols of status and recognition. For Agamemnon to take Achilles' prize was to dishonor him publicly, to diminish his standing among the warriors. Achilles, his pride wounded and his honor insulted, withdrew from battle. He refused to fight. This might seem like petulance, the tantrum of a spoiled warrior. But consider what it meant. The Greeks needed Achilles. Without him, they suffered defeat after defeat. The Trojans, led by Hector, their greatest warrior, drove the Greeks back toward their ships. Men died because Achilles would not fight, yet Achilles remained in his tent, nursing his anger, watching his comrades fall. Here we see the complexity that makes Achilles more than a simple hero. He could be selfish, prideful, capable of putting his personal honor above the lives of his friends. The ancient Greeks didn't see this as a flaw that disqualified him from heroism. Instead, they saw it as part of the full, complex reality of human nature. Heroes weren't perfect. They were extraordinary, but still human. As the Greeks' situation grew desperate, Agamemnon sent an embassy to Achilles, offering magnificent gifts and the return of Briseis if he would rejoin the battle. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix pleaded with him, but Achilles refused. His anger ran too deep. He questioned the entire war, wondering aloud why he should risk his life for Agamemnon's pride over Helen. It took the death of Patroclus to change everything. Patroclus was Achilles' closest companion. In some traditions, they were cousins, in others, lovers. The exact nature of their relationship matters less than its depth. They had trained together under Chiron, fought side by side for 9 years at Troy. Patroclus understood Achilles in ways no one else did, and Patroclus, seeing the Greeks driven back to their ships, could no longer bear to watch. He begged Achilles to let him wear Achilles' armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. Perhaps the Trojans would mistake him for Achilles and retreat. Achilles agreed, but warned Patroclus to drive the Trojans from the ships and then return. Do not pursue them to Troy's walls. Patroclus promised. Wearing Achilles' gleaming armor, Patroclus led the Myrmidons into battle and achieved spectacular success. The Trojans, thinking Achilles had returned to the fight, fell back in disarray. But Patroclus, caught up in the glory of battle, forgot his promise. He pursued the Trojans to the very walls of Troy. There, Hector, the greatest Trojan warrior, faced him and, with Apollo's help, struck him down. When Achilles learned that Patroclus was dead, his grief transformed into a rage that dwarfed his earlier anger at Agamemnon. This was not wounded pride. This was the agony of devastating loss. His mother Thetis, hearing his cries of mourning, came to him. She warned him, if he goes back to battle to avenge Patroclus, if he kills Hector, his own death will follow soon after. The prophecy bound them both. Achilles did not hesitate. Vengeance and love for his fallen friend mattered more than life itself. His choice at Skyros had brought him to Troy. This choice would complete his fate. He would have his revenge, whatever the cost. Thetis, knowing she could not dissuade him, went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, who forged for Achilles new armor of surpassing beauty and strength. The next day, Achilles returned to battle. His fury was apocalyptic. He killed Trojans by the dozen, filled the river Scamander with so many corpses that the river god himself rose up in protest. Nothing could stand before him. At last, he faced Hector, the Trojan hero who had killed Patroclus, who wore the armor he had stripped from Patroclus's body. They fought before the walls of Troy, with both armies watching. Hector was a formidable warrior, brave and skilled, but Achilles was something more. He was wrath incarnate, grief-given form. He killed Hector, and, in his rage and grief, desecrated the body. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it through the dust around the walls of Troy. For days, Achilles refused to give up Hector's body for burial. He held funeral games for Patroclus, honoring his friend with all the rites due to a great warrior. But his grief would not subside. Night after night, he dragged Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb, unable to let go of his rage. Then came King Priam. Hector's father, the aged king of Troy, performed an act of breathtaking courage. Guided by the gods, he entered the Greek camp at night, alone and unprotected, and came to Achilles' tent. He kissed the hands that had killed his son, the hands that had dragged his son's body through the dirt. He begged Achilles to remember his own father, to show pity, to return Hector's body for proper burial. In this moment, Achilles saw beyond his rage. He saw an old man destroyed by grief, just as his own father would be destroyed by grief when news of Achilles' death reached home. He wept with Priam, not as enemies, but as two men crushed by the cost of war. He agreed to return Hector's body. He called a truce so the Trojans could hold funeral rites. This scene, near the end of the Iliad, shows us another dimension of Achilles. Capable of terrible rage and violence, yes, but also capable of compassion, of recognizing shared humanity even in an enemy. This complexity makes him endure as more than a simple warrior figure. The Iliad ends before Achilles' death, but we know the rest of the story. Paris, Hector's brothers, and the man who had sparked the war by taking Helen shot an arrow guided by Apollo. The arrow struck Achilles, in his one vulnerable spot, his heel. The greatest warrior of the Greeks died not in glorious single combat, but from an arrow wound, brought down by his one weakness. Yet even in death, his glory lived on. The Greeks mourned him with funeral games. His ashes were mixed with those of Patroclus and buried in a great mound on the coast, a landmark that ships would see as they passed. His armor was fought over by the remaining Greek heroes. His name became synonymous with martial excellence. In the centuries since, Achilles has remained one of the most compelling figures in Western literature. He represents the warrior ideal, but also its costs. He achieved the immortal glory he chose, but at the price of life itself. His story asks us to consider, what would we sacrifice for greatness? What price would we pay for our names to echo through the ages? As you drift toward sleep, consider Achilles on the beach at Troy, knowing his death approaches, yet fighting anyway. Sometimes, courage means facing certain death for something you believe in. Sometimes, it means letting go of rage and showing mercy. And sometimes, just sometimes, it means accepting that our greatest strengths and our greatest weaknesses are inseparable parts of who we are. Alexander the Great, ambition without borders. From the legendary shores of Troy, we move forward in time to the realm of verified history, to a man whose conquests were so vast that the ancient world was never the same. His name was Alexander, and he would be called the Great for creating an empire that stretched from Greece to India in just 13 remarkable years. Picture the Macedonian court in 356 BCE. King Philip II, a man who had transformed Macedonia from a minor kingdom into the dominant power in Greece, receives news that his wife Olympias has given birth to a son. The baby is named Alexander. Legends would later claim that on the night of his birth, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned down, as if the goddess herself had left her shrine to attend Alexander's birth. Such stories, whether true or embellished, reflect how profoundly Alexander would shape his world. Alexander's childhood was extraordinary. His mother Olympias was a princess from Epirus and a devotee of mystic religions. She raised Alexander with the belief that he was descended from Achilles through her lineage and from Heracles through his fathers. She encouraged him to see himself as destined for greatness, perhaps even descended from the gods themselves. This conviction of divine ancestry would follow Alexander throughout his life. When Alexander was 13, his father Philip hired the greatest philosopher of the age to be his tutor. Aristotle, student of Plato and one of the most brilliant minds in Greek history, came to Macedonia to educate the young prince. For 3 years, Alexander studied under Aristotle at a school established specially for him and other noble youths at Mieza. Aristotle taught him philosophy, medicine, literature, and the sciences. He instilled in Alexander a love of Homer's Iliad. Alexander reportedly carried a copy of the Iliad with him throughout his campaigns, keeping it in a precious casket alongside his dagger. But Alexander was more than just a scholar. At 16, while his father was away campaigning, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia. When a Thracian tribe called the Maedi rebelled, the teenage prince led the army against them, defeated them, and founded a city called Alexandropolis. At 18, he commanded the cavalry at the crucial Battle of Chaeronea. where Philip defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, establishing Macedonian dominance over Greece. The young Alexander proved he was a warrior as well as a thinker. Then, in 336 BCE, when Alexander was 20 years old, his father was assassinated at a wedding ceremony. The circumstances were murky. A disgruntled bodyguard named Pausanias stabbed Philip, but many suspected wider conspiracies. Some even whispered that Olympias or Alexander himself might have been involved, though evidence for this is scanty. What is clear is that suddenly, Alexander found himself king of Macedonia and hegemon of the Greek League at just 20 years of age. His challenges were immediate. Greek city-states saw Philip's death as an opportunity to rebel. Thebes rose in revolt. Northern tribes threatened Macedonia's borders. But Alexander moved with lightning speed, the hallmark of his military genius. He marched north and crushed the rebellious tribes. Then he turned south to Greece. When Thebes revolted, Alexander made a brutal example of the city. He destroyed it utterly, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom he admired. The message was clear. Defiance would be met with overwhelming force. The other Greek cities quickly fell in line. With Greece secured, Alexander turned his attention to the plan his father had been preparing before his death: an invasion of the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Empire was the superpower of the ancient world, stretching from Egypt to India. It had vast wealth, enormous armies, and a long history of conflict with the Greek world. Philip had been preparing to lead a Greek army to free the Greek cities in Asia Minor from Persian rule. Now Alexander would fulfill that vision, but on a scale his father never imagined. In spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with about 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Upon landing in Asia, he made a pilgrimage to Troy, the legendary city of the Iliad. There, he made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, his ancestor and hero. He was 22 years old and stood at the beginning of a campaign that would change the world. The Persian Empire was ruled by Darius III, who had come to the throne only 2 years before Alexander. Darius initially underestimated the young Macedonian king. The first major battle came at the Granicus River, where Alexander faced Persian satraps and their forces. Alexander fought at the front of his troops, as he would in every major battle. He was nearly killed when a Persian noble struck him with a sword, splitting his helmet. One of Alexander's companions, Clytus, saved his life, cutting down the attacker. Alexander won a decisive victory and began liberating the Greek cities of the coast. The next major confrontation came at Issus in 333 BCE. Darius III himself led the Persian army this time, with perhaps 100,000 men against Alexander's 40,000. The battle was fierce, fought in a narrow plain between the mountains and the sea. Alexander personally led the cavalry charge that broke through to Darius. The Persian king, seeing Alexander cutting his way toward him, fled. His army, seeing their king flee, collapsed. Alexander had defeated the great king of Persia in personal combat. Rather than immediately pursuing Darius, Alexander turned south toward the Mediterranean coast. His strategy was methodical: secure the coastline, deny the Persian navy bases, consolidate his conquests. He besieged Tyre, an island fortress that had never been taken by force. For 7 months, Alexander's engineers built a causeway from the mainland to the island. When the city finally fell, Alexander had demonstrated he could take any city, no matter how impregnable it seemed. From Tyre, Alexander moved into Egypt, which welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. In Egypt, he founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile. It would become one of the most important cities in the ancient world, a center of learning and culture for centuries. While in Egypt, Alexander made a dangerous journey across the desert to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis. What the oracle told him, he never revealed. But afterward, he showed increasing signs of believing he was the son of Zeus. Whether this was sincere belief, political theater, or gradual megalomania, we cannot say. Perhaps it was all three. In 331 BCE, Alexander finally moved inland to confront Darius again. At Gaugamela, in what is now about northern Iraq, Darius assembled the largest army he could muster. Ancient sources claim he had 1 million men, though modern historians estimate closer to 100,000. Alexander had perhaps 50,000. Darius chose flat ground perfect for his cavalry and chariots. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals suggested attacking in darkness. Alexander famously replied, "I will not steal victory like a thief." The Battle of Gaugamela was Alexander's masterpiece. Through brilliant tactical maneuvers, he drew the Persian army out of position and personally led his cavalry in a charge directly at Darius. Once again, faced with Alexander himself, Darius fled. This time, his empire fell with him. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph. He took Susa and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, with its immense treasures. The Achaemenid Empire, which had stood for over 2 centuries, collapsed in less than 3 years. But Alexander did not stop. He pursued Darius into the eastern provinces. Before Alexander could catch him, Darius was assassinated by one of his own satraps, Bessus, who hoped to gain favor with Alexander. Instead, Alexander hunted down Bessus and had him executed for regicide and treason. Alexander saw himself now not as a conqueror, but as the legitimate ruler of Persia, responsible for avenging his predecessor. For the next 3 years, Alexander campaigned in the eastern reaches of the empire, in what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. These were hard campaigns against tough opponents in difficult terrain. He founded numerous cities named Alexandria to secure his conquests. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian dress, incorporating Persian nobles into his administration. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, uniting Greek and Persian bloodlines. These changes troubled many of his Macedonian companions. They had come to conquer Persia, not to become Persian. Tension grew. In 328 BCE, during a drunken argument, Alexander killed Clitus, the man who had saved his life at Granicus. Clitus had accused Alexander of abandoning Macedonian ways and becoming too Persian. Alexander, drunk and enraged, seized a spear and killed his old friend. When he sobered and realized what he had done, he was consumed with grief, shutting himself in his tent for days in anguish. This incident reveals the darker aspects of Alexander's character. He was capable of terrible violence, not just in battle, but in personal rage. The absolute power he wielded, the constant campaigning, the belief in his own divine destiny, all of this took a psychological toll. In 326 BCE, Alexander crossed into India. He wanted to reach the eastern edge of the world, which the Greeks believed was somewhere beyond India. In the Punjab, he faced King Porus at the Hydaspes River. Despite Porus having elephants, terrifying to the Macedonians who had never faced them in large numbers, Alexander won another brilliant tactical victory. Impressed by Porus's courage in battle, Alexander let him keep his kingdom as a subject ally. But Alexander's army had reached its limit. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years since leaving Macedonia. They had crossed deserts and mountains, fought in blazing heat and monsoon rains. When Alexander announced plans to continue east to the Ganges, the army refused to go further. This was not quite a mutiny. They would have fought if Alexander ordered them, but they begged him to turn back. For the first time in his career, Alexander had to accept a limit he could not overcome. He agreed to return. The journey back was harrowing. Alexander led part of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest places on earth. The march claimed thousands of lives from thirst, heat, and exhaustion. It may have been worse than all the battles they had fought. Some historians believe Alexander chose this route to prove he could succeed where previous legendary expeditions had failed, another sign of his increasing grandiosity. Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, planning new campaigns. He wanted to conquer Arabia. He organized mass marriages between Macedonians and Persians, trying to create a unified empire. He trained Persian youths in Macedonian warfare. He planned to be both conqueror and unifier, to create something new from Greek and Persian cultures. But then, suddenly, Alexander fell ill. After a prolonged drinking party, Alexander often drank heavily. He developed a fever. For days, he grew worse. His soldiers, hearing their king was dying, insisted on filing past him one last time. Too weak to speak, Alexander acknowledged each man with his eyes. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. He left no clear successor. His generals, the Diadochi, would fight for decades over his empire, eventually splitting it into the Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean until Rome conquered them. But Alexander's conquests had lasting effects. Beyond politics, he had spread Greek culture across the known world, creating a cultural fusion that produced Greco-Buddhist art, Hellenistic Judaism, and countless other hybrid cultures. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean. The cities he founded became centers of learning and commerce. Was Alexander great? He was certainly extraordinary. His military genius remains undisputed. His personal courage inspired fierce loyalty. His vision stretched from Greece to India. But he was also capable of terrible cruelty. He destroyed cities. He killed friends in drunken rages. His ambition knew no bounds, human or geographical. As you rest now, think of Alexander on the banks of the Beas River in India, the farthest point his conquests reached. For once in his life, he faced a limit he could not overcome. Not an enemy army, but the exhaustion of his own men, the practical impossibility of conquering everything. Sometimes, the greatest lesson heroism teaches is knowing when to stop, when to turn back, when to accept limits. Alexander achieved extraordinary things, but perhaps he also shows us the price of boundless ambition, the cost of never being satisfied, of always reaching for more. Joan of Arc, Faith in Flames. From the vast empire of Alexander, we travel forward nearly 1,700 years to medieval France, to a small village in Lorraine, where a peasant girl would hear voices that would change the fate of a kingdom. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, though we know her as Joan of Arc, and her story is one of the most remarkable in human history. Picture France in the early 15th century, torn by war, occupied by foreign armies, bleeding from decades of conflict. The 100 Years' War had ground on since 1337, a brutal struggle between England and France over territories and royal claims. By the time Joan was born around 1412, the English controlled much of northern France, including Paris. The French royal family was in disarray. The king, Charles VI, suffered from recurring bouts of mental illness. The Dauphin Charles, his son and heir, had not been crowned king, as the traditional coronation city of Reims lay in enemy territory. Without coronation, his claim to the throne remained questionable. In the village of Domremy, on the border of territory loyal to Charles and territory controlled by Burgundy, French nobles allied with the English, lived the d'Arc family. They were peasants, but not serfs, relatively prosperous with a farm and livestock. Their daughter Joan tended the family's sheep and learned to sew, but never learned to read or write. It was an ordinary life for a medieval peasant girl. Until the voices came. Joan was about 13 years old when she first heard them. She was in her father's garden when she saw a great light and heard a voice. The voice told her to be good, to go to church, to live virtuously. Later, she identified the voice as that of Saint Michael the Archangel. Soon other voices followed, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, virgin martyrs of the early church. For years, the voices gave her spiritual guidance, but eventually they gave her a mission. She must go to the Dauphin Charles. She must help him lift the English siege of Orleans. She must see him crowned king at Reims. The voices told her she would succeed, but warned that she would not live long. Imagine being a teenage peasant girl, illiterate, living in a war-torn countryside, and being told by divine voices that you must speak to the uncrowned king, lead his armies, and change the course of history. The sheer audacity of believing, much less acting on, such a mission is breathtaking. For years, Joan resisted. She was just a girl. She knew nothing of warfare. But the voices insisted. Finally, in 1428, when she was about 16, she made her first attempt to reach Charles. She went to Robert de Baudricourt, the commander of the nearest town loyal to Charles, and told him God had commanded her to lead the French army to victory. Baudricourt dismissed her as deluded and sent her away. Joan persisted. She returned to Baudricourt, this time making specific predictions about French defeats that proved accurate. Eventually, whether convinced by her prescience, her conviction, or simply desperate enough to try anything, Baudricourt gave her a horse, a sword, and an escort of soldiers. They would take her across enemy territory to Chinon, where Charles held court. The journey took 11 days through lands patrolled by enemy soldiers and bandits. Joan traveled dressed as a man, wearing male clothing for safety and practicality. This detail, her wearing men's clothes, would later be one of the charges used against her in her trial. But for now, she reached Chinon safely in February 1429. Meeting with the Dauphin presented another challenge. According to legend, when Joan was brought into Charles's presence, he tested her by hiding among his courtiers while another man sat on the throne. But Joan walked directly to Charles and addressed him, despite having never seen him before. She spoke to him privately, telling him things that convinced him she was genuine. What she said, we don't know. Charles never revealed it. But whatever passed between them, Charles decided to trust her. Before letting her lead his army, Charles had Joan examined by theologians and doctors. They interrogated her about her visions, tested her theological knowledge, verified her virginity. They found nothing heretical in her beliefs and declared her sincere. Charles gave her armor, a banner, and permission to accompany his army to Orléans. Orléans was under siege. The English had surrounded the city, building fortified positions, slowly strangling it. If Orléans fell, the English would control the Loire Valley, and French resistance might collapse entirely. French attempts to break the siege had failed. The situation seemed desperate. Then Joan arrived, wearing white armor, carrying a banner that showed God blessing the French royal arms. She demanded the English leave France. They mocked her. She rode into Orléans on April 29th, 1429, and the city erupted in joy. Her presence alone lifted morale. People flocked to see her. Soldiers took heart. She was, they believed, sent by God. Over the next 9 days, Joan participated in a series of assaults on the English fortifications around Orléans. She was wounded by an arrow, but returned to the fighting. She rallied troops when they faltered. She insisted on aggressive tactics, refusing to wait for slow sieges. Her courage and conviction were infectious. On May 8th, the English abandoned their siege and retreated. Orléans was saved. This was Joan's first miracle, as people saw it. A teenage peasant girl with no military training had done what experienced commanders had failed to do. The victory at Orléans changed everything. It shattered the perception of English invincibility. It gave the French hope. It made Joan a symbol of divine favor. She pressed her advantage. In the Loire campaign, she accompanied French forces as they cleared the English from strongholds along the Loire River. At the Battle of Patay in June 1429, the French crushed an English force, killing or capturing thousands. It was a reversal of past French defeats like Crécy and Agincourt. The road to Reims lay open. In July 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing beside him, holding her banner. She had fulfilled the mission her voices had given her. She had seen the Dauphin crowned. France had a legitimate king, but Joan's voices told her that her time was short. She urged Charles to press the advantage, to drive the English out of France entirely. But Charles, cautious by nature, preferred negotiation to warfare. Joan participated in an assault on Paris. but it failed, and she was wounded again. The court's faith in her began to waver. Had she accomplished what God intended, and her later failures showed she was no longer blessed? Or were they failing her by not following her counsel? In early 1430, Joan organized a company of volunteers to relieve Compiègne, besieged by Burgundian forces. During a skirmish outside the town on May 23rd, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers. The gates of Compiègne closed behind her retreating troops. She was left outside, surrounded. For a woman who had achieved the seemingly impossible, who had heard divine voices and changed the fate of a nation, her capture must have seemed incomprehensible. The Burgundians sold Joan to the English for 10,000 livres. King Charles, whom she had crowned, made no serious attempt to ransom or rescue her. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps he feared association with her if she was deemed heretical. Perhaps political considerations made her inconvenient. Perhaps he simply lacked the funds or will. Whatever the reason, Joan was abandoned by the kingdom she had saved. The English wanted Joan dead, but they wanted her death to be legitimate, legal, sanctioned by the church. They arranged for her to be tried for heresy by the Inquisition. The trial took place in Rouen, an English-controlled territory, beginning in January 1431. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, presided. He was a supporter of English interests, though to be fair, many in the region were Burgundian sympathizers who saw Joan as an enemy. The trial was a mockery of justice from the start. Joan was kept in chains in a military prison, guarded by English soldiers who harassed her. She was denied counsel. She was interrogated by trained theologians and canon lawyers while she remained an illiterate peasant girl. Yet she defended herself with remarkable skill and intelligence. They questioned her about her visions. How did she know the voices were from God? What did they sound like? What did the saints look like? They tried to trap her with theological questions. When asked if she was in God's grace, Joan gave an answer that stunned her interrogators. "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me." It was a perfect answer. To claim certain knowledge of God's grace would be heresy, as would claiming to be outside it. Her response was theologically impeccable. They questioned her about wearing men's clothing. Was this not a violation of biblical law? Joan explained she wore it for protection, for practicality in military campaigns. But her judges seized on this point. They insisted she must wear women's clothing. Throughout the trial, Joan maintained her dignity and her conviction. Yes, she heard voices. Yes, she believed they came from God. Yes, she had done everything at divine command. She would not recant. When they showed her instruments of torture, she said that even under torture, she would not say anything different. And if she did, she would later say it was forced from her. The outcome was predetermined. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was declared a relapsed heretic and sentenced to death. The method of execution was burning at the stake, a common punishment for heresy. She was 19 years old. They burned her in the marketplace of Rouen. She asked for a cross and held it as the flames rose. Witnesses reported that she called out to Jesus repeatedly until she died. The English burned her body 3 times to ensure nothing remained and threw her ashes into the Seine River. They wanted to prevent her remains from becoming relics, but they could not erase her legend. Within 25 years, Charles VII ordered a retrial. The verdict was overturned. Joan was declared innocent, a martyr. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. The peasant girl who heard voices had become Saint Joan of Arc. Joan's story resonates because it contains elements that seem impossible. A teenage girl with no education, no training, no resources, transformed the course of a war and ensured the survival of a kingdom. She faced armies and theologians with equal courage. She was betrayed by those she had served and died with her faith unshaken. What drove her? Was she delusional, suffering from what we might now diagnose as schizophrenia or temporal lobe epilepsy? Was she a political pawn, manipulated by factions at Charles's court? Or did she truly hear divine voices calling her to save France? The truth may be that these explanations are not mutually exclusive. She may have experienced genuine religious visions while also being used by political forces. She may have suffered from a condition that caused auditory hallucinations while also displaying genuine military and diplomatic brilliance. The power of her story lies not in explaining away the mystery, but in recognizing the courage it took to follow her conviction. Whatever its source, Joan faced death knowing she would die. Her voices had told her she would not live long. She could have recanted, could have admitted she was deluded, could have saved her life. Instead, she chose to die rather than deny what she believed to be true. That is a form of heroism that transcends military victory, the courage to face death for the sake of truth. As the image of Joan at the stake fades, holding her cross in the flames, calling out to Jesus, let us move forward in time to a very different kind of hero. One who would also transform a nation, but through methods that would have been unimaginable to Joan, not through the sword, but through its absence. Mahatma Gandhi, strength and stillness. Picture a small, thin man in a simple white cloth, walking through crowds that part before him like the Red Sea. His weapon is not a sword or a gun, but his conviction, his willingness to suffer, his unshakable commitment to nonviolence. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, though the world would know him as Mahatma, meaning great soul. He would show that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in striking back, but in refusing to strike at all. Gandhi was born on October 2, 1869, in Porbandar, a coastal town in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat. His family belonged to the merchant caste, and his father served as the chief minister of Porbandar. It was a comfortable, traditional Hindu upbringing. Gandhi was married at 13, as was customary, to a girl named Kasturba. She would remain his wife for 62 years until her death in 1944. As a young man, Gandhi was unremarkable. He was shy, mediocre in school, afraid to speak in public. When he was 19, his family sent him to London to study law. In London, Gandhi tried to become an English gentleman. He took dancing lessons, wore Western clothes, studied French and Latin, but he also made a vow to his mother that he would not eat meat, drink alcohol, or be promiscuous. This vow connected him to vegetarian societies in London, where he began reading about philosophy and religion, including the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture that would profoundly influence his thought. After qualifying as a barrister, Gandhi returned to India in 1891. He tried to establish a law practice in Bombay, but was too nervous to speak in court. He returned to his hometown, but his career remained stalled. Then, in 1893, an opportunity came. A law firm in South Africa needed someone to work on a case for a year. Gandhi accepted. South Africa changed his life. As an Indian in a British colony with a significant white settler population, Gandhi experienced racial discrimination directly. The famous incident came soon after his arrival. He had purchased a first-class train ticket, but a white passenger objected to sharing the compartment with an Indian. When Gandhi refused to move to third class, he was thrown off the train at Pietermaritzburg station. He spent the night in the cold waiting room, his luggage confiscated, deciding whether to return to India or stay and fight. He chose to stay. Over the next 21 years in South Africa, Gandhi developed the philosophy and tactics that would change the world. He experienced the daily humiliations of racism, being beaten for refusing to give up his seat to a white passenger, being forbidden from walking on sidewalks, watching Indian immigrants treated as inferior beings despite being subjects of the same British Empire. Gandhi organized the Indian community in South Africa to resist unjust laws. When the Transvaal government required all Indians to register and carry permits at all times, Gandhi led a campaign of resistance. He called it satyagraha, which translates roughly as holding firmly to truth or soul force. The concept was revolutionary. Protesters would break unjust laws openly, accept punishment without resistance, refuse to cooperate with evil, but never resort to violence. This was not passive resistance. It required tremendous courage. Gandhi and his followers were beaten, arrested, imprisoned, but they never struck back. They filled the jails until the system could not function. They created moral pressure through their willingness to suffer. Eventually, the South African government had to negotiate. During these years, Gandhi transformed himself. He simplified his life, giving up Western dress for simple Indian clothes. He took vows of celibacy and poverty. He started living in communities based on self-sufficiency and shared labor. He was developing not just political tactics, but a whole philosophy of life based on truth, nonviolence, simplicity, and fearlessness. In 1915, Gandhi returned to India, now famous for his work in South Africa. India was still under British rule, and the independence movement was growing. Gandhi initially focused on local issues, helping indigo farmers and textile workers resist exploitation. But he was learning about India, traveling widely, listening to ordinary people. In 1919, the British passed the Rowlatt Acts, which allowed imprisonment without trial. Gandhi called for a nationwide day of prayer and fasting in protest. The protests turned violent in some places, particularly in Amritsar, where British troops under General Dyer opened fire on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. Gandhi was horrified by both the massacre and by the violence of some protesters. He called off the movement, saying he had made a Himalayan miscalculation in thinking India was ready for non-violent resistance. But Gandhi learned from this setback. Over the next decades, he would launch several major campaigns of non-violent resistance against British rule. The non-cooperation movement in the early 1920s encouraged Indians to boycott British goods, British schools, British courts. The goal was to make India ungovernable without violence. In 1930, Gandhi launched perhaps his most famous campaign, the Salt March. The British held a monopoly on salt production, a commodity essential to life in India's hot climate. They taxed it heavily. Gandhi decided to break the salt laws by marching to the sea and making salt from seawater. It was a simple, symbolic act that anyone could understand and participate in. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi, then 60 years old, began walking from his ashram in Ahmedabad to the coastal town of Dandi, about 240 miles away. He walked for 24 days. By the time he reached the sea, thousands had joined him. On April 6th, he picked up a lump of natural salt from the beach, violating the law. Across India, people began making illegal salt. Tens of thousands were arrested, including Gandhi. But the campaign captured world attention. It demonstrated the absurdity of the British position, arresting people for picking up salt, and the courage of the Indian people. Gandhi spent years in British prisons. He used these periods for reading, writing, and reflection. He also engaged in fasts, hunger strikes that put his life at risk. He fasted to pressure the British, but also to pressure Indians. When Hindu-Muslim violence broke out, Gandhi fasted until both communities pledged peace. When untouchability, discrimination against the lowest caste, continued, Gandhi fasted until reforms were promised. His fasts were moral weapons, turning his own suffering into a force for change. Gandhi's philosophy was deeply rooted in Indian traditions, but also influenced by diverse sources. He read Tolstoy, Thoreau, Ruskin, and the Gospels. He believed in the essential equality of all religions, the dignity of manual labor, the importance of village life and self-sufficiency. He opposed both British imperialism and modern industrialization, which he saw as dehumanizing. But Gandhi was not without contradictions and controversies. His views on sexuality were extreme. He saw sex as animalistic, even within marriage, and advocated celibacy. He conducted experiments sleeping naked with young women to test his control over sexual desire, which many found deeply inappropriate. His attitudes toward caste, while reformist, did not go as far as complete abolition, disappointing many. His insistence on nonviolence sometimes seemed to ignore practical realities. During World War II, he urged the British to surrender to Hitler rather than fight, believing nonviolent resistance would work even against the Nazis, a position that horrified many, including some of his closest followers. His relationship with his family was strained. His eldest son broke with him over his father's rigid expectations. Gandhi demanded his followers live by principles that he himself imposed, creating a cult of personality some found troubling. He was a man of tremendous moral force, but also of contradictions, someone whose private behavior did not always match his public principles. Despite these complexities, Gandhi's impact on India's independence movement was immense. By the end of World War II, Britain was exhausted and could no longer hold its empire. Indian independence was inevitable. In 1947, India finally gained independence, but it came at a terrible price: partition. India was divided into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The partition led to one of the largest mass migrations in human history and horrific communal violence. Millions fled their homes. Perhaps 1 million people died in the riots and massacres. Gandhi was devastated. He had dreamed of an independent India where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others lived together in peace. Instead, his country was torn apart by religious hatred. He spent his last months trying to stop the violence, walking through riot-torn areas, fasting for peace. He was now 78 years old, frail, his health broken by decades of fasting and imprisonment. On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was walking to a prayer meeting in New Delhi. A man named Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who believed Gandhi was too sympathetic to Muslims, stepped forward and shot him 3 times at point-blank range. Gandhi collapsed, reportedly saying, "Hey Ram, oh God." He died within minutes. The man who had preached nonviolence all his life died by violence. The man who had worked for Hindu-Muslim unity was killed by a Hindu extremist. The irony was bitter. India and the world mourned. Einstein called Gandhi a leader of his people, unsupported by any outward authority. A politician whose success rests not upon craft, nor the mastery of technical devices, but simply on the convincing power of his personality. Gandhi's legacy is complicated. He showed that nonviolent resistance could work, inspiring movements from Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights campaign to South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle. He demonstrated that moral force could challenge empire. But he also showed the limitations of nonviolence. It works best against opponents with some moral scruples, some concern for world opinion. Against truly ruthless opponents, it may not suffice. His personal life, with its extreme asceticism and controversial experiments, complicates his saintly image. He was human, flawed, sometimes wrong, but he was also someone who risked everything for what he believed, who endured decades of imprisonment and hardship, who was willing to die for his principles, and eventually did. As you rest, think of Gandhi walking to the sea to pick up salt, or sitting calmly in prison, or fasting until his body could barely sustain life, all to change his country without violence. Sometimes, the hardest battles are not against external enemies, but against our own impulses toward anger and retaliation. Sometimes, the greatest strength is the strength to refrain, to endure, to hold to truth, even when force seems easier. Gandhi showed that this kind of strength can move nations. Nelson Mandela, the long walk to freedom. From India's struggle for independence, we move to another fight against oppression, this time in South Africa, where a system of racial segregation called apartheid denied the majority black population basic human rights. And we meet a man who would spend 27 years in prison, emerge without bitterness, and lead his country from the brink of civil war to a peaceful transition to democracy. His name was Nelson Mandela, and he would show that forgiveness can be more powerful than revenge. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the village of Mvezo, in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. His father was a local chief and counselor to the king of the Thembu people. Mandela's birth name, Rolihlahla, meant pulling the branch of a tree, or colloquially, troublemaker. It would prove prophetic. When Mandela was 9, his father died. The young boy was sent to live with the acting regent of the Thembu, who raised him as his own son. This gave Mandela an education and opportunities unusual for a black child in segregated South Africa. He attended Methodist schools, where a teacher gave him the English name Nelson. He was groomed to become a counselor to the Thembu king, learning about leadership, about listening to all voices in council, about building consensus. But Mandela had other ideas. At 23, faced with an arranged marriage, he fled to Johannesburg. There, he encountered the full reality of apartheid. South Africa was governed by a white minority that had systematically stripped black South Africans of political rights and economic opportunities. Black people needed passes to travel, could not vote, were restricted to certain occupations and residential areas. They were second-class citizens in their own country. In Johannesburg, Mandela worked various jobs and completed his law degree through correspondence. He joined the African National Congress, or ANC, an organization founded in 1912 to fight for black rights. When the National Party came to power in 1948 and formalized apartheid into law, making racial segregation official government policy, Mandela became more deeply involved in resistance. Along with his friends Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, Mandela helped found the ANC Youth League, which advocated more militant tactics than the ANC's traditional approach of petitions and diplomacy. They organized boycotts, strikes, and campaigns of civil disobedience. Mandela, now a lawyer, opened South Africa's first black law firm with Tambo, providing legal defense for victims of apartheid laws. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, encouraging people to deliberately break apartheid laws and accept arrest. Mandela traveled the country organizing resistance. He was arrested multiple times, banned from gatherings, restricted in his movements, but he continued to work underground when necessary. The government's response to resistance grew more brutal. In 1960, police opened fire on a peaceful protest in Sharpeville, killing 69 people, most shot in the back as they fled. The government banned the ANC. Mandela went underground, becoming known as the Black Pimpernel for his ability to evade capture while continuing to organize resistance. At this point, Mandela and other ANC leaders made a fateful decision. For decades, the ANC had been committed to nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi's example. But after Sharpeville, after the government's violence and the banning of peaceful protest, they concluded nonviolence alone would not work. They formed a military wing called Umkhonto we Sizwe, or Spear of the Nation. Mandela helped lead it. Their strategy was sabotage of government installations, not terrorism against civilians. They bombed power stations, pass offices, and other government buildings, carefully timing attacks to avoid casualties. It was a limited use of violence, but it was violence nonetheless. This decision would define how Mandela was perceived for decades. To the government, he was a terrorist. To the oppressed, a freedom fighter. In 1962, Mandela left South Africa illegally to meet with African leaders and receive military training. When he returned, he was arrested. In court, he refused to defend himself against the charges, instead giving a political speech condemning apartheid. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But while in prison, police raided ANC headquarters and found documents detailing the sabotage campaign. Mandela and other ANC leaders were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The Rivonia trial, as it became known, began in 1963. The defendants faced the death penalty. On April 20th, 1964, Mandela gave his statement from the dock. It lasted over 4 hours and has become one of the most famous political speeches in history. He explained why the ANC had turned to violence, described the oppression of apartheid, and outlined his vision for South Africa. He ended with words that would echo through history. "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The courtroom fell silent. The judge, facing international pressure, sentenced Mandela and the others to life imprisonment rather than death. On June 12, 1964, Mandela arrived at Robben Island, a bleak prison off the coast of Cape Town. He was 46 years old. He would not leave prison for 27 years. Robben Island was brutal. Prisoners broke rocks in a quarry under the harsh sun. Political prisoners were kept in a separate section, in tiny cells with thin mats on the floor. They were given short pants rather than long trousers, a deliberate humiliation. They received fewer rations than other prisoners. Mandela was allowed one visitor every 6 months and could write and receive one letter every 6 months. The letters were heavily censored, yet Mandela maintained his dignity and his spirit. He continued his legal studies, earning a law degree while in prison. He organized secret classes, turning the prison into what he called Mandela University, where prisoners taught each other various subjects. He fought for better conditions through official channels, writing countless letters and petitions. When authorities placed him in isolation as punishment, he emerged unbowed. Over the years, Mandela became increasingly famous internationally. The Free Mandela campaign grew into a global movement. Musicians wrote songs about him. Governments imposed sanctions on South Africa. Yet the apartheid government refused to release him unless he renounced violence. Mandela refused. "What freedom am I being offered?" he said in a statement read by his daughter. "While the organization of the people remains banned, only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." In the 1980s, South Africa descended into crisis. International sanctions damaged the economy. Internal resistance intensified. Township uprisings made the country increasingly ungovernable. The military costs of maintaining apartheid grew unsustainable. Even within the ruling National Party, some leaders began to realize apartheid could not continue. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became president. Pragmatic and facing economic collapse, he began secret negotiations with Mandela, who had been moved to a house in a prison compound. On February 11, 1990, de Klerk announced he was unbanning the ANC and releasing political prisoners. That day, Mandela walked free. The images of Mandela leaving Victor Verster prison, his fist raised, his wife Winnie beside him, became iconic. He was 71 years old. He had entered prison in his 40s, in the prime of life. He emerged an old man. He had missed seeing his children grow up. His marriage to Winnie, strained by decades of separation and her own radicalization, would eventually end in divorce. Prison had taken the best years of his life. What would Mandela do with his freedom? Many feared a bloodbath. South Africa teetered on the edge of civil war. Black South Africans, after generations of oppression, wanted justice. Some wanted revenge. Right-wing whites armed themselves, threatening to fight rather than surrender power. Political violence claimed thousands of lives as different factions struggled for position in the coming new order. Mandela chose reconciliation. He began negotiations with de Klerk for a transition to democracy. He urged his followers to avoid violence. When Chris Hani, a popular ANC leader, was assassinated by a white extremist in 1993, South Africa seemed ready to explode. Mandela went on national television and made an emotional appeal for calm. His moral authority prevented disaster. The negotiations were difficult. The National Party wanted protections for whites in the new South Africa. The ANC demanded one person, one vote. Extremists on both sides tried to derail the process, but Mandela and de Klerk kept talking. In 1993, they jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. In April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections open to all races. Lines stretched for miles as Black South Africans, many elderly, cast votes for the first time in their lives. Some had waited hours, even days, but they waited patiently. They were making history. The ANC won overwhelmingly. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. What made Mandela's presidency remarkable was not just that he had won, but how he governed. He could have pursued retribution against those who had imprisoned him and oppressed his people. Instead, he chose forgiveness. He formed a government of national unity that included members of the National Party. He kept white civil servants in their jobs. He reached out to the white community, even inviting one of his former prison guards to his inauguration. Most famously, in 1995, when South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup, Mandela embraced rugby, a sport beloved by white South Africans but largely ignored by blacks. When the South African team, the Springboks, made it to the final against New Zealand, Mandela attended wearing a Springbok jersey. When South Africa won, the moment became symbolic of national unity. Black and white South Africans celebrated together. It was depicted memorably in the film Invictus. Mandela also established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The commission allowed those who had committed crimes during apartheid to confess and seek amnesty. Victims could tell their stories. It was not perfect. Many felt it let perpetrators off too easily, but it provided a path to confront the past without descending into cycles of revenge. Mandela served only one term as president, stepping down in 1999. This peaceful transfer of power was itself remarkable in a continent where leaders often clung to power. Mandela believed in democratic principles strongly enough to voluntarily give up power. In retirement, Mandela became an elder statesman, speaking out on issues from AIDS to poverty to peace. When he criticized Western leaders, including American presidents, for their foreign policies, his moral authority made the world listen. He continued working through his foundation on education and AIDS initiatives. As he aged, Mandela's health declined. He died on December 5, 2013, at age 95, surrounded by family. The world mourned. Presidents and ordinary people alike paid tribute to a man who had shown that forgiveness and reconciliation were not signs of weakness, but of extraordinary strength. Mandela's story raises profound questions about justice and forgiveness. Was he right to choose reconciliation over retribution? Some Black South Africans felt betrayed, believing apartheid's perpetrators got off too lightly, that economic inequality persisted because Mandela made too many concessions. Others believe his approach prevented a bloodbath and gave South Africa a chance at peace. What seems clear is that Mandela's choices required tremendous moral courage. It would have been psychologically easier, more emotionally satisfying, to emerge from 27 years of imprisonment filled with hatred and seeking revenge. Instead, he emerged preaching forgiveness, working with his former oppressors, trying to build a nation from the ruins of apartheid. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela wrote, "I knew that people expected me to harbor anger toward whites, but I had none. In prison, my anger toward whites decreased, but my hatred for the system grew. I wanted South Africa to see that I loved even my enemies, while I hated the system that turned us against one another." This distinction, hating the system but not the people who operated it, allowed Mandela to work for justice without seeking revenge. It was perhaps his greatest achievement, greater even than becoming president, emerging from decades of injustice capable of forgiveness and hope. As you drift toward sleep, think of Mandela walking out of prison after 27 years, choosing forgiveness over bitterness, reconciliation over revenge. Think of him extending his hand to his former jailers, inviting them to help build a new nation. Sometimes, the hardest victory is the victory over our own anger, our own desire for retribution. Sometimes, the truest heroism lies not in defeating enemies, but in turning enemies into partners, in choosing the difficult path of peace over the easier path of continued conflict. The threads that bind them. We have journeyed through 3,000 years of history, from the legendary shores of Troy to ancient Macedonian Empire, to medieval France, to colonial India, to apartheid South Africa. We have met warriors and peacemakers, conquerors and liberators, a peasant girl who heard voices, and men who changed the world. These 5 individuals, Achilles, Alexander, Joan, Gandhi, Mandela, lived in vastly different times and places. They faced different challenges and chose different methods. Yet threads connect them, patterns that reveal something fundamental about human courage and the nature of heroism. The first thread is sacrifice. Every one of these heroes gave up something precious for something they valued more. Achilles sacrificed a long life for imperishable glory. He chose to die young at Troy, rather than live old and forgotten at home. Alexander sacrificed comfort, safety, and eventually his health for his vision of a unified world stretching from Greece to India. Joan gave up a quiet life in her village, then gave up her life itself rather than renounce her visions. Gandhi sacrificed his law career, his comfortable life, his relationship with his family, spending years in prison and enduring repeated fasts that nearly killed him. Mandela sacrificed 27 years of his life, watching from prison as his children grew up without him, all for the dream of a free South Africa. These sacrifices were not imposed from outside. They were choices. Each of these individuals could have chosen differently. Achilles could have stayed home. Alexander could have been content ruling Macedonia. Joan could have ignored her voices. Gandhi could have been a successful lawyer. Mandela could have accepted early release in exchange for renouncing violence. But they didn't. They chose the harder path because something in them demanded it. This points to a second thread, a sense of purpose beyond personal interest. None of these heroes acted purely for personal gain. Achilles fought for glory, yes, but glory in service of his comrades, his people. Alexander sought to spread Greek culture and unite diverse peoples, not just conquer for conquest's sake. Joan fought to save France. Gandhi dedicated his life to freeing India. Mandela struggled to end apartheid and build a democratic South Africa. They were driven by visions larger than themselves. This sense of transcendent purpose gave them extraordinary strength. When you believe you are acting for something greater than yourself, whether it is eternal glory, divine mission, national freedom, or justice, you can endure hardships that would break someone motivated only by personal interest. This is perhaps why we call them heroes, not just because they succeeded, but because they connected their individual will to something universal, something that resonated with others and inspired them to believe and act as well. A third thread is the complexity of their character. None of these heroes were pure or perfect. Achilles could be prideful, selfish, cruel in his treatment of Hector's body. Alexander destroyed cities, killed friends in drunken rages, showed signs of increasing megalomania. Joan, while remarkable, was part of a brutal medieval war where both sides committed atrocities. Gandhi's personal behavior, particularly regarding sexuality and his experiments with young women, troubles many. His extreme asceticism sometimes harmed those around him. Mandela's decision to endorse violence, even limited violence, contradicted his later stance on reconciliation. His economic policies as president disappointed many who hoped for more radical redistribution of wealth. Acknowledging these complexities does not diminish these individuals. Rather, it makes their achievements more remarkable. They were not saints or gods, but flawed human beings who nonetheless accomplished extraordinary things. Their flaws make their courage more accessible, more human. If perfect beings achieved great things, we might admire them but not feel we could emulate them. But seeing that flawed, struggling, sometimes failing human beings can still change the world, that gives us hope. A fourth thread is the willingness to face death. Achilles knew he would die at Troy. Joan knew her mission would be brief. Alexander pushed himself and his army to extremes that eventually killed him. Gandhi's fasts brought him to death's door repeatedly. Mandela faced the death penalty and spent decades in conditions that could have killed him. This proximity to death, this willingness to risk everything, seems essential to their heroism. Perhaps facing death clarifies what matters. When you know you might die, trivial concerns fall away. You focus on what truly matters. You find courage you didn't know you possessed. Each of these heroes faced this clarifying terror and emerged not paralyzed, but energized, ready to act despite the risk. Their acceptance of mortality paradoxically gave them power. Yet there is a fifth thread, more subtle, the relationship between action and patience. between force and restraint. Achilles was mighty in battle, but also showed mercy to Priam. Alexander was a conqueror, but also a visionary who tried to unite cultures. Joan was a warrior, but also someone who wept at the suffering of soldiers, even enemy soldiers. Gandhi turned away from violence to embrace nonviolent resistance, showing that restraint could be more powerful than force. Mandela chose forgiveness over revenge, reconciliation over retribution. This suggests that true heroism involves balance, knowing when to act and when to refrain, when to fight and when to forgive, when to push forward and when to accept limits. The purely aggressive hero, who only knows force, eventually destroys himself and others. The purely passive hero, who never acts, accomplishes nothing. The greatest heroes navigate between these extremes, finding the appropriate response to each situation. A sixth thread is the role of timing and circumstance. Would Achilles be remembered if not for the Trojan War? Would Alexander have conquered anything if Philip hadn't built the Macedonian army? Would Joan matter if France hadn't needed a symbol of hope? Would Gandhi have developed satyagraha without experiencing racism in South Africa? Would Mandela have become Mandela without apartheid? Heroes emerge at moments when history needs them. They are shaped by their circumstances even as they shape those circumstances. This is not to diminish their agency or achievement, but to recognize that heroism is relational. It arises from the interaction between an individual's qualities and the demands of their moment. The same person in different circumstances might live and die unknown. In the right moment, they change the world. This leads to a seventh thread. Their impact extended far beyond their lifetimes. Achilles has been dead for 3 millennia, if he ever lived at all, yet we still tell his story. Alexander's empire fragmented immediately after his death, yet the Hellenistic culture he spread influenced. The Hellenistic culture he spread influenced philosophy, art, and science for centuries. Joan's short life inspired centuries of faith, courage, and devotion. Gandhi's method shaped movements for justice across the world, from Montgomery to Manila. Mandela's example continues to guide nations grappling with division and forgiveness. Their lives were finite, but their impact radiated outward, rippling through generations like waves that never truly fade. And that brings us to perhaps the final thread that binds them all: the transformation of suffering into meaning. Each of these figures endured tremendous pain. Achilles lost his closest companion. Alexander burned with unfulfilled ambition. Joan was betrayed and burned alive. Gandhi was imprisoned and assassinated. Mandela spent the prime of his life behind bars. Yet none of them allowed suffering to hollow them. They transmuted it, like alchemists of the soul, into something luminous, something that could outlast death. Their pain became a bridge between their mortality and their immortality. True heroism, perhaps, lies in that act of transformation. To take fear and turn it into courage, to take loss and turn it into compassion, to take suffering and make it a gift for others. And when you look at them, across centuries, across cultures, you see how this pattern repeats. History itself is like a great tapestry woven of such transformations, with each generation inheriting both the struggles and the light of those who came before. If you look closer, you might see something else in that weave, a reflection of ourselves. We tend to think of heroes as distant, monumental figures, but heroism has always been a mirror. It reflects the potential within ordinary people. Achilles reminds us of the fire of passion, the hunger for excellence. Alexander reminds us of vision, the daring to dream of a world larger than the one we inhabit. Joan shows us faith and purity of purpose, the courage to act even when alone. Gandhi teaches that stillness can be power, that peace can conquer empire. Mandela reminds us that forgiveness can rebuild nations where vengeance would have destroyed them. These are not supernatural gifts. They are human possibilities, the highest notes our species can play. You have them too. Every person does. The ability to stand firm when afraid, to believe when hope feels foolish, to endure when everything says give up. These are not reserved for legends. They live quietly in us, waiting for the moment they are called upon. And yet, it is not only their strength that endures in memory, but their stillness. Listen closely to their stories, and you'll hear silence at the center of each. Achilles staring into the sea, knowing his fate. Alexander gazing into the endless horizon, wondering what lies beyond. Joan praying in her cell the night before her execution. Gandhi in meditation, calm amid chaos. Mandela sitting in his small cell on Robben Island, reading by the dim light, patient, unbroken. In those silences, we see the secret of endurance. The great paradox of courage is that it does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it breathes. Sometimes, courage is simply the act of waiting without losing faith. If you close your eyes now, imagine them all, gathered across time, across the dreamscape of history. Achilles stands by the sea. Alexander watches from the mountains of Asia. Joan kneels in quiet prayer. Gandhi walks beneath the Indian sun. Mandela stands beneath the open sky of Africa. 5 souls bound by courage, each carrying a light through the darkness of their age. They speak in different tongues, but their message is the same. Do not let fear decide who you are. Do not mistake gentleness for weakness. Do not think your actions too small to matter, because every great act began as a quiet conviction in a single heart. Every movement, every transformation, every moment of courage began with someone who refused to bow to despair. The quiet hero. Within, we speak often of heroes as though they exist only in history, yet if you look around, or within, you'll find them everywhere. In the nurse who stays late to comfort a patient when the shift is long over. In the parent who works 2 jobs to keep a promise of safety and warmth. In the teacher who believes in a child no one else sees. In the person who stands up for another when silence would be easier. In you, when you keep going through uncertainty, through loss, through the quiet weight of ordinary days. This is the unrecorded heroism of the world, the kind that fills no epics, that leaves no monuments, but without which life would collapse. It is the same thread that runs through Achilles and Joan and Mandela, unseen but unbroken, binding the extraordinary and the everyday into one vast human story. when the world feels heavy, when the night feels endless, remember this: heroism is not the absence of fear. It is the decision, again and again, to keep the light alive. To choose love in the face of hatred, peace in the face of rage, integrity in the face of convenience. That too is a kind of battle, quieter, slower, but no less profound. Sometimes all the world asks of you is to endure, to hold on, to keep believing that what you do matters, even if no one sees it yet. So, as you drift deeper into stillness, know that these stories are not only about the past. They are part of you now. They move quietly through your mind like gentle tides, whispering reminders of what you are capable of. Because courage is not ancient. Compassion is not extinct. Forgiveness is not foreign. They live in every breath we take, every small act of kindness, every moment we choose hope over despair. Epilogue: the eternal light. There's a moment just before sleep when the world softens, when the walls between memory and dream begin to fade. That's where the heroes live, not on pedestals or in textbooks, but in that space between waking and rest, where we remember that every life, however brief, leaves ripples that touch others. The ancient poets said that heroes were half divine, born of gods and mortals. But perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps the divine is born in the human, in those moments when we transcend fear and act from love, when we become, even for an instant, more than what we were. If you could look down the long river of time, you would see them all, not as statues, not as names, but as lights, some bright and fierce like fire, others soft and steady like candles. Together they form a constellation of human courage stretching across the centuries. And you too are one of those lights. Small perhaps, but real. You carry within you the same spark that burned in Achilles' heart, the same vision that drove Alexander across deserts, the same faith that lifted Joan to her purpose, the same stillness that guided Gandhi, the same forgiveness that freed Mandela's soul. The world may never write songs about your battles, but someone, somewhere, perhaps someone you love, perhaps someone you will never meet, will live differently because of your quiet courage. And that is enough. That is how the story continues. So breathe deeply. Let the tales fade into the rhythm of your heartbeat. Feel time itself slowing around you, like a great tide drawing back into the ocean. The heroes have walked their paths. You have walked beside them. Now, it is time to rest, to lay down the armor, to unclench the hands, to close the eyes, and return to the gentle silence where courage begins. You are safe. You are strong. You are, in your own quiet way, heroic. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow, the world will need your light again.